Hello everyone, this is Tom in Los Angeles. As you can see, it's January the 17th today, 17th of January, and it basically looks like it's summer again here, nice and warm outside, which is one of the wonderful things about Southern California. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the 11th canto of Inferno, and it might be a little bit of a shorter video than usual because the canto is very descriptive, and it's also a canto that is a little peculiar because it doesn't present any particular monster or creature. Personally, I find canto number 11 very, very interesting, in particular because Dante, the writer, the author, in a certain sense comes out and very openly, very directly quotes Aristotle as really the main inspiration for the overall structure of Inferno. As we know, there are different sources and different inspirations that Dante used for the Divine Comedy, especially for the architecture of the Divine Comedy. Dante loved Aristotle very much. We already seen how he presents him in limbo, in the middle of this beautiful castle. Even if it's in hell, it's really almost like a royal position for Aristotle, honored and by everybody. And this is why the structure of Inferno has these 9 circles, and they are structured as they are, while in Purgatory Dante will apply more strictly what St. Thomas and the scholastic philosophy was saying at his time about the 7 capital sins, and he follows that structure much more strictly because in Purgatory you have 7 circles as Dante and Virgil climb up Purgatory. So yeah, it's a peculiar canto because we don't have any specific action or particular references. Only in the beginning we see that Virgil and Dante are at the edge of the 6th circle and at the beginning of the 7th. There is a terrible stench that is coming up from below, which is a sign that the heaviness and the seriousness of the sins committed by the souls below are worse and worse, they're worsening. But it's also a literary device for Dante to really make a pause and stop with Virgil and ask the proper questions that he wants to ask Virgil. In fact, he doesn't ask a direct question here, but it's almost funny how Dante, while Virgil suggests that they stop, Dante asks him to simply have a chat about something interesting. Let's have a chat about something interesting. And then Virgil launches into a very detailed description of the architecture of Inferno, and especially the circles that will come after this canto. I want to make a quick comment about the language, how in particular at the very beginning of this canto, in the original version, Dante is using a number of R's in the Italian that is very high. And this is one of the things that, as I discussed before, are difficult to, or impossible to render in a translation. The sound of these first lines is in sulla estremità di un'alta ripa che facevan gran pietre rotte in cerchio, venimmo sopra più crudele stipa, e quivi per l'orribile soperchio. You can hear so many R's in the text. There are, as always, better and worse English translations. I'm reading from Musa's here, and which, as always, is a little bit simple with the good and the bad that comes with that. So, a quick comment about this great tome that Virgil and Dante see at the very beginning of the canto. Within lies Anastasius, the Pope Photinus lured away from the straight path. He's another heretic, and one note to make here is that Everyone today realizes that this was a misunderstanding, not only on Dante's side, but on the knowledge of his time. The culture of his time was taking a particular source as fully reliable. This source is Gratian of Chiusi, a jurist from the 12th century, who we will actually find in Paradiso in Canto 10. Dante will put him in Canto 10. But today he's considered unreliable by most scholars, and therefore this quote of Anastasius, there is some discussion. Somebody says that instead of the Pope, Dante meant the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, who lived between 491 and 520. There are some discrepancies, but really that's not the point of this canto. I believe the best thing here is to take one of those beautiful, let's say, schemes or schematics of Dante's Inferno that are very well made. I know that, for example, in Mark Musa's translation, there is a copy of one, which is this one. Very simple and very well made, and it shows how the clear distinction between the upper hell and the lower hell is something that Dante, the character, the pilgrim in this moment, still isn't very clear about. So he's going to ask a couple of questions, and Virgil is not going to be happy to hear these questions. He's going to slap Dante on his wrists. I think it's very well explained here by Musa about the way that doctrine permeates the Divine Comedy and the way that gradually comes out in the open. He says that note how the pilgrim has become a student eager to learn. The Inferno consists to a great extent in action. Church doctrine is usually revealed first by the realistic panorama, but as he learns more and more by example, by action, he begins to hear more and more philosophical and theological doctrine from his teachers, from Virgil, Beatrice, and then later Saint Bernard, who is going to bombard Dante with doctrine and philosophy and theology in Paradiso. The preponderance of doctrine increases in purgatory and then grows even greater in paradise. For us, the distinction is pretty simple in a sense, because once we get into the seventh circle, the sin of violence as a general category is punished. Within violence, we have the wood of suicide, the violence against three persons in a sense, violence against another person, against yourself, and against God. And then going down deeper, you have all the various layers and all the various degrees of fraud or malice, and Virgil describes all of them, not even in a perfect order. In fact, Dante doesn't seem to care about that. In this canto, he just has Virgil describing 8 out of 10, and he doesn't seem to be too concerned about precision in this case. In any case, it's very clear that Aristotle has a very crucial place in this canto, like I mentioned. In verse 75, where Dante asks Virgil, basically, what's the difference between the part of Inferno outside of the city of this and the part that is inside? And Virgil scolds him a little bit, and he goes, what brings your thoughts to wander so from the proper route? Don't you recall a passage in your Ethics, the words that treat three dispositions counter to heaven's will? He says your Ethics because of how much Dante loved Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. Incontinence, malice, and insane brutality. Really here we need to focus on incontinence and malice. Insane brutality refers to the violent sins, but the main distinction is between incontinence, that refers to what we've seen in the first 5 circles of Inferno, and malice, that is more serious and more important as a sin and more hated by God because it's made with a full will and full intent by human beings. That's where it gets really interesting, because for somebody who knows at least a little bit like about the Aristotle writings and about Nicomachean ethics, which I haven't read in full for sure. That's for sure. But maybe one day I will. There is a reflection of the conflict that many people in the Middle Ages always had between the importance of Aristotle, whose writings had been translated and passed on, especially by Arab thinkers and intellectuals, and so Dante could read him, and obviously the Christian theology that was in many parts very much at odds with Aristotle's beliefs and thinking. So, in particular, we could say that one of the most important conflicts between Aristotelian ethics and Christian ethics is that for Aristotle, the main source of happiness for a human being is contemplation. However, the object of this contemplation is a God who is not at all like the Christian God. Is a God that doesn't really provide divine justice, and is not a God that assures providence, and certainly is not a personal God who loves his people. Also, an important point is that for Aristotle, the subject of contemplation, the human being, had a unity of soul and body. So the soul was mortal just like the body, which is completely opposite to what Christian beliefs say, that the soul is immortal. So for Dante, ancient humanism was in this sense deficient because of its inability to transcend the limits of reason. This is a very important point, and we've seen it in a metaphorical way in Virgil's behavior, Virgil impersonating reason. If the key to understanding Dante, to understanding how he tries to combine Aristotle's ethics with the Christian ones by having the Christian ones prevail, is that in his view, human reason by itself is not enough to achieve the highest possible happiness for a human being. You need to go beyond. You need to be in communion with God. By the way, we'll see later on in a few cantos how there is a perfect example in Ulysses of somebody who is unable to recognize the limits of reason, and so Dante goes back to this concept of reason as extremely high and noble but insufficient. Aristotle's position towards sin, simply related to this incontinence and malice that Dante describes in Inferno, is that the reason there is sin is internal pressures telling one to do the opposite of what they know is the correct thing to do in a situation. Those who are virtuous are not even tempted by these internal pressures. Aristotle explains that there are three types of non-virtuous people: those who are tempted by the internal pressures but still act virtuous, and they are the continent; those who are too weak to resist the internal pressures and therefore act sinfully, and they are the incontinent; and those who are strong enough to resist the internal pressures but choose not to, out of desire for luxury or domination, and they are the viceful. This is kind of the basis from which Dante sources this distinction between incontinence and malice or fraud, and that explains why fraud and malice are more hateful to God sins than the other ones. The second question that Dante asks, and that gets a slap on his wrist again, is about usury. In particular, he asks, could we retrace our path back to the place where you say that usury offends celestial goodness, and solve that knot for me, please? Fairly so, Dante asks, why is usury supposed to be a sin against God? In part, I've read some scholars say that it's believed that Dante's father was practicing usury in their time. But we need to remember that in ancient times and still in medieval times, the term usury tended to identify the lending of money in general. The modern meaning of usury, if you go to an Oxford dictionary or any Western dictionary at least, you will find that it specifies that usury stands for an excessive rate of interest in lending money. Without a specification that can be different country by country, state by state, etc. But in Dante's times, and even more important for Aristotle, usury was simply, and even more important actually for the Bible, usury was simply lending money and get a profit out of it. Why? Because Aristotle, in line with the ancient thinking and what we find more or less in the Bible as well, thought that money, being nothing but a tool, could not generate anything by itself. And so people who were getting rich or profit or benefit out of something that is nothing were almost sinful of placing themselves in the place of God, because only God can generate things like plants or vegetables from a field or any other creation-related generation. And in fact, this is in line with Virgil's answer. He refers Dante to the physics of Aristotle. He says, "You'll be shown in not too many pages that your art's good is to follow nature insofar as it can, as a pupil emulates his master." To be honest, it's a topic that could be discussed forever, this of usury, because it's made even more delicate by the fact that it's not only an ethically debatable topic, but it's also an economically debatable topic. And economic science, as it's today, basically didn't exist in Aristotle times, in part because the Greek economic reality of Aristotle was very likely not complex enough to necessitate the creation of complex economic theories. And therefore Aristotle focused very much on the ideal or abstract portion of usury, and so that's why he said usury is a sin, is sinful in any case. It was only later on in history, in fact, and I think Francis Bacon in the 1500s was one of the first to, in a certain sense, rehabilitate the socially useful role of money lending, that this was understood, and then later on it was developed in actual economic doctrine. And today we know that without capital investments, without people who took risks with their capital, industrial revolution would not have been possible. Many things that have helped society immensely would not have been possible. So our point of view is completely different from the ancient one. But the topic is still very delicate, because where is the perfect line between something that is a fair interest rate that covers the lender from risks, from all the different costs, and something that is excessive or actual usury, because usury exists today as well. One interesting aspect of this history that we could call history of money lending is in the Jewish tradition. In the Jewish tradition, in the Torah, the sacred books don't really allow any usury among Jews. However, there is a little bit of a loophole where Jewish people are allowed to lend money and to practice usury with people who are not Jewish. And in a certain sense, this is what allowed, in history and the Middle Ages as well, the development of particular groups of Jewish people in Europe as well, who were lending money to non-Jewish. because from the Christian point of view, there was another type of hypocrisy, in a certain sense, where the Christian ethics would not allow usury at all. You just need to help those in need with money without asking anything back. But the church was very happy, has been very happy throughout history, to get the benefits of economic benefits of partnering with anybody who was practicing usury, including Jewish people, etc. So this is in part, only partially, what has spurred a negative sentiment towards the Jewish in Europe in the Middle Ages, and has created some myths and stereotypes that culminated in figures, for example, like Shylock in Shakespeare. In any case, this chapter of the history of moneylending would not be sufficiently covered even in a full conference, because it's so complex. I would like to understand it more myself, but I hope this quick overview of the 11th canto was interesting, and thank you all for watching and for making this journey through the Divine Comedy with me in these COVID days that are certainly made more interesting by interesting reads and by reflecting on the Divine Comedy that is still for me the best book ever written in the world. So thanks very much. I look forward to your comments and to the next canto.